Hi, everybody, and welcome to this latest session in Digital Outcomes. I want to first of all thank you all for joining us over in session 2, which is called Thriving in the Chasm. And we're actually doing something a little bit different for this session. So it's Kelly and I who are going to actually be talking a little bit about our perspectives from inside the chasm. We're going to explain a little bit more about what that means in a moment. What distinguishes successful travelers on both sides of that practitioner-provider divide as it comes to this chasm, and what can we all learn from it? Now, Kelly, you just ran over from your opening session with Jaime from the US Department of State. And so thanks for hopping across into this session.
Absolutely. It's the great thing about digital tech. I didn't have to literally run over. I just stayed right here. No, but it was a great session. And one of the things that stands out in my mind from what Jaime shared that I think will come up in this session, he talked about, the classic stool of people, process, and technology. But he added culture. And not only did he add culture, but he talked about how that's actually the most important thing of all. Yeah. So for all of our talk of digital and technology and automation and data, of course, there's still a human thread running through all of this. And that journey is part of what we're going to talk about for the next half an hour.
Yeah, and I think that's something that when we look at digital transformations and the points of failure for digital transformation, it's very rarely the technology that was chosen. It's the being able to get the adoption that you need and the journey kind of along the way. We talk about that a lot, and how the importance of culture comes in, where there really isn't a single, like, okay, here's the process, here's the playbook, let's just go and put this playbook into place and it's going to work for everybody, because culture drives different considerations. And I think that's where sometimes transformations come unstuck as well.
Absolutely. Now, is the expression culture eats strategy for breakfast, or is it the other way around? It's still early here on the East Coast.
I think that's it, but I don't want anybody to quote me on it. So what I want to do, first of all, is I mentioned that this idea of a chasm. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about the concept. And it comes from a book called Crossing the Chasm, which is, I don't know how many years old it is. There you go. It's something that I first came across certainly 12, 13 years ago, with a provider in an industry that was, really at its beginnings. And it's talking about, how can we think about encouraging folks to think differently, ultimately. So it was written by Geoffrey A. And the concept was really about how do people embrace disruptive ideas. And this chasm is a gap essentially between folks who are in businesses that are innovators, and ideas that are innovative ideas, and kind of you're looking at the adoption. And when you have disruption, you have innovative ideas. Usually it's, there's not that much adoption when you take the whole kind of the big picture of the number of people doing something. So let's say some ideas within procurement that may be disruptive. That's kind of one side of the chasm. And then the mainstream on the other side of the chasm. So, that innovators is new technology, new operating models that are being embraced, but the mainstream is more traditional procurement. Yeah. And so the idea of this chasm is, how long, or if at all, can these new ideas cross that chasm to being really only adopted by kind of early stage innovators, early stage adopters, to become mainstream, kind of pushing out what is considered mainstream today, along to being kind of not in use anymore. So we want to talk a little bit about, how do we think about, as procurement, think about that chasm of these new procurement ideas, and how do we help them become mainstream?
Well, and it's interesting because there's always sort of a bleeding edge of everything. And then there's the mass majority that want things to be a little bit more stable, want things to be a little bit more straightforward, wants the business case to be easier. And maybe this is me being selfish, but I always look at these charts, and once I understand the concept, my next thought is always, where am I on this chart? And it doesn't actually matter what kind of a chart it is. So when I thought about, okay, where is the Art of Procurement team, not only on this chart, but in this journey, it occurred to me that we actually live in the little chasm space. We live in that space between the innovators and the early adopters. Then there's that break where we spend our time, and then you move on to the early majority. So we have people moving in multiple directions within that chasm, and we're trying our best to help everybody get to where they're going with ideas. And one of the things that, and maybe it's helpful that we've been practitioners, that we've worked as consultants and providers, we've sort of sat in all these different seats, but we end up empathizing with all of the different groups on these journeys. So you have procurement startups who are desperately trying to get from that sort of test case situation where just a few bold organizations will run pilots to where there's an explosion of demand and they can finally scale and they finally have the money coming in. And then on the practitioner side, you have procurement organizations, whether it's procurement experience, like we just heard Jaime talk about at the US Department of State, or whether it's Johnson & Johnson that we're going to hear about next, talking about having their procurement garage and testing out startups and then building and scaling those internally. It's figuring out how to make that business case and how to transition through the uncertain time to where you actually have an ROI that you can talk about, that you can share, and you can build something bigger on. Now, we learn different things from everybody on this journey, but even though there are sort of people on different sides and people moving in different directions, everybody is ultimately trying to do a better job with the technology available to them without introducing undue risk into the organization.
Yeah, I think that risk point is really important because I think we do see kind of part of our role is to bridge that gap. Yes. And we've taught for years around driving change with confidence. And this idea of, for an idea to become mainstream, for old ideas to be pushed out and replaced by new ideas, there has to be confidence in their success. And so we're able to share a lot of success stories along the way through all the different content pieces that we do. But that's really an important piece. And the other thing is that, I think sometimes there's a tendency for us to look, not us, but I think society generally, to say, well, if you're on one side of the chasm, which is, the status quo versus the early adoption, that there is some fundamental issue with, well, why don't you get it? Why are you having, problems or anything like that? And that's not the case because everybody's situation is different. Everyone's journey is different, but the circumstances under which everybody is operating under is different. So it may be that you have the desire, but you're not in a situation where you can actually make that leap yet. And that shouldn't be looked down upon. That should more be taken as, okay, kind of how can I do that in a small way rather than a big leap?
And we often talk to people around why. So what's your why? And whether it's digital transformation or whether it's a supplier diversity initiative or a sustainability program, understanding and being able to articulate your why is incredibly important because there will be a whole cascade of decisions that ultimately have to be made in that area. And then different internal and external factors having an influence on those decisions.
Mm-hmm. And now I did just see, I wanted to make a note. I saw a notification that there may not be a box for questions underneath the session. So we're working on that in the background because we do like to bring as many questions as we can into the session. But while we're working on that, there's actually, as we built up to digital outcomes, we did a series of polls over probably the last 6 weeks ago to talk about ultimately, how are we taking digital transformation? How are we embracing it? How are we implementing it? How are we putting it into practice? And so, we've talked about the role that the organizations like Art of Procurement play, but one of the questions that we thought would be interested to ask is, what has the most impact on your decision to purchase a specific digital procurement platform? And I'm just going to read this for anybody who may be listening to this and not just watching and seeing the slide. So we gave 4 choices, and we have peer recommendations at 33%, own research at 26%, analyst reports at 25%, and RFP responses at 15%, which is fascinating. It's fascinating how much we put in an RFP and yet only 15% of folks say that RFP responses has the biggest impact, with peer recommendations being the top. How do you kind of read those results?
So I actually read this as incredibly exciting. I wish we had sort of a benchmark on this same poll question, maybe 3 years and 5 years ago, because what I read from the 33% that said peer recommendations has the greatest impact is that procurement is truly functioning as a community. One of the things that I think in the past has been sort of this mantra is that knowledge is power, right? And so we have to be careful about how much we share on social. We have to be careful what we say at conferences. We have to be careful how we network and what we expose outside of the company. But But at the end of the day, nobody understands the objectives and challenges the way our peers do. And I love the fact that that connectivity is starting to build, because it will have an impact on digital investments, but also on the strength of the community as a whole.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think, as I mentioned before, the RFP issue was really interesting, because you kind of assume that that's where decisions are made, and of course that's what we pitch when we're pitching procurement, the services of procurement internally, to enable us to run RFPs. But at the end of the day, folks talk to each other, and it's all about confidence. It's hard to get confidence. It's the nature of the RFP process makes it difficult to look at an RFP response and have full confidence that, yes, I know they can do what I need them to do, because you don't know how contrived, or you're always putting forward your best foot from an RFP response. Whereas when you're talking to your peers, you kind of get the good, the bad, and the ugly.
Well, and I think the other two takeaways, sort of, let's say one for each side of this conversation. If you're in procurement and you're thinking about trying a new digital platform, or you're looking at maybe experimenting with a startup, ask your peers for recommendations.
Mm-hmm.
People are clearly willing to offer them if they're having the greatest impact on these decisions. At the same time, if you're a provider, if you're a startup, be aware of the fact that these peer recommendations are ultimately what are driving decisions. And so leverage that word of mouth and those existing relationships every bit as much as you do your other marketing and PR efforts.
Yeah, and so we have the opportunity to talk to a lot of folks, whether it's interviewing podcasts, doing webinars, interviewing people for writing white papers. As you bring together all the perspectives of the people that you're talking to, who are talking about journeys that have been successful, what kind of qualities do those have?
Well, I think the big thing, and we've already touched on this a little bit, is how you deal with risk. So it's having a healthy relationship with it. It's being able to function in an environment where there is some amount of uncertainty. And I think maybe what helps people get past that in many cases, Jaime talked in the last section about his vision. Having that vision that pulls you forward and allowing that to give you the courage and the incentive to push through the uncertainty, that's one of those things that motivates on the journey.
Mm-hmm.
But you're also regularly having executive level conversations, whether for the pod or off the record. I'd be curious to know your thoughts about this as well.
Yeah, I think that, we may talk a little bit later about connecting with needs and goals of the business.
Yeah.
Very important. Not doing anything in isolation. I think that we see a lot of, initiatives that are done in isolation that have the best intentions,
Mm-hmm.
but don't necessarily take into consideration a lot of the touch points or dependencies until you get into the implementation phase.
Yeah.
And then when you get into the implementation phase, it's almost like it's too late. When all of a sudden you realize that you really have to be talking to these people in IT who need to be doing something that weren't necessarily engaged. I think that's a big point of, not a point of failure. That's probably too harsh but it's another obstacle to overcome as you go through the process.
And that's ironic, isn't it? Because one of the things procurement has talked about for forever is that people don't get us engaged early enough in the process. So we're dutifully running our RFPs with those InfoSec questionnaires that we probably don't read, probably didn't consult IT about. And then maybe at the last minute we say, hey, can one of you take a quick look through this for us? When in fact, they're an enormous source of knowledge and understanding internally that we should be leveraging earlier in the process, just like we want people to involve procurement earlier.
Mm-hmm. So let's bring in our second poll. I'm going to bring it on the screen there. If you would like to walk us through kind of the second question that we asked.
Sure. So the second question we asked is, what is the greatest barrier to realizing and demonstrating the ROI of digital investments? So in the top spot, we had adoption with 42%, being able to quantify the benefit of the solution itself at 32%. There's your implementation, Phil, at 17%. And then finally, 10% with functionality. So what jumps out at you about these results and what they tell us?
Well, I think it tells us all, again, around what we talked about coming from Jaime's session, of culture and people and change management. It's, again, only 10% saying that the tool didn't do what they wanted it to as being the greatest barrier to ROI is pretty telling. Whereas actually getting people to use it was the biggest problem, or not necessarily even use the tool. It's the concept of change. I think it goes beyond whether a tool is usable or not. There's plenty of tools that have got high usability that I'm sure are not getting the adoption that they should, for reasons that are not because people didn't know how to go in and use it and know which buttons to press.
Yeah. And that also brings us to the point of sort of, again, when do you get people involved?
Mm-hmm.
People can be sold on the value of a platform or a process change, even a new supplier, long before the time comes that they actually need to work with that process or a digital platform or supplier. And so making sure that you're building that relationship, that culture is aligned, that you understand the overall business objectives, and making sure that people feel included in the selection process, even if they grumble a little bit about having additional meetings, because then that carries through the strength and success of the implementation. And that ultimately is what determines adoption, which, as we see here, is the number one thing we need to overcome in order to demonstrate and measure ROI.
Yeah, and the second being quantifiable benefit, which really is asking, well, what is the ROI?
Yeah.
And I think that from my experience, that's where you'll sometimes get, it ties into the needs of the business. So do you really know what you're solving for and how you're going to measure success? And a lot of times you'll see, a business case that's being presented to you, from a provider, for example, to say, this is what success should look like in 3 years' time.
Yeah.
Or in 2 years' time, or 1 year, or 5 years, or whatever the kind of time horizon is. And, perhaps an organization looks at that and says, okay, I can kind of make the connection between this benefit in the business case, but I can't necessarily see the connection between this, and this, or we don't count savings in that way, because typically these are based around, savings-based business cases. If we had a better idea of the why and had the buy-in on the why from the broader organization, then the quantifiable benefit, and I've seen organizations again where this has happened, the benefits may be softer, but they are generally accepted across the folks who are ultimately paying the bills of that technology, or making the budget available for that technological implementation.
Yeah. And certainly we want to win over whoever's paying the bills. But at the same time, I think there's a way for procurement to be smart on our journey to scale. So every company has those internal influencers. A lot of times they're not even necessarily in the C-suite, but they're people that everyone looks to. They're regarded as leading thinkers. They would definitely be before the chasm. They're innovators. They're experimentation-focused people. They have that healthy relationship with risk. And so if we can use them as a sounding board, make them feel a little bit of ownership in the journey, and then leverage them as sort of pollinators in the company, that I would think is going to win people over much more quickly to trying something new and giving it the benefit of the doubt, just because a very small group of people bought in.
Yeah, it's spreading the risk almost.
Absolutely.
You don't necessarily want to be the one person who's advocating for something against their wishes or desires, or not even, not necessarily against, but faced against just no interest, or people being having, well, I don't really need this. It's not something that's important to me, and you're kind of going all the way to try and push against it, or push for it. Sorry. So there's many people that you can get that you can sell on the idea of, and whether it's a new operating model, whether it's new technology, to actually buy in and be an advocate for that. It helps you overcome the roadblocks or the hurdles along the way, when, ultimately very little goes perfectly to plan 100% every single time.
Except at Art of Procurement.
Yeah.
Everything always goes perfectly.
We're always having fun with technology.
Yes, I did my knock on wood earlier, so I'm not going to jinx myself by unknocking it. No, but back to the point about peer recommendations, maybe if there's a connection between the two polls that we've shared so far, it's that, yeah, absolutely ask what platforms or what startups they're trialing, they're piloting, they're working with, but also ask, who received this well? What were some of the questions and objections you received internally that I can maybe get a little bit of a head start on figuring out my response to? That's all part of what we can learn from each other as well.
Mm-hmm. So let's bring on the third poll that we ask. So we asked for this poll in 2023. Our procurement organization intends to prioritize digital investments based on. The top answer was improving the user experience. The second was driving procurement outcomes. The third was driving company outcomes. And the fourth was based on external market conditions. Now, there's something interesting in the middle there of procurement outcomes being above company outcomes. How do you see those results?
I mean, ideally, if we're aligned, if everybody's read their 10X and listened to the podcast, you know that the ultimate goal is for procurement outcomes to drive company outcomes. And so I do love that improving the user experience came in at the top, because we're not just saying the most important thing is savings or risk, at least for its own sake. But it would be nice maybe for next year, everybody, if we could work on this, if we could get procurement outcomes and company outcomes within 1% of each other, that's probably a good goal, because we do really want those things to be very closely aligned.
Yeah. Do you think that procurement outcomes, because you think, how do you answer these questions? And sometimes, they can get lost in translation. But procurement outcomes over company outcomes suggest that we're still thinking about, in some cases, ourselves and what we're trying to achieve versus what the company is trying to achieve.
And I do think it's how we interpret certainly this poll question, but also how we interpret what our priorities are. And one of the things that I think comes into that interpretation, and I have the advantage in that I've spoken to everybody that we're bringing on stage today and tomorrow. I'm already thinking forward to your session with Jack Freeman from Peakspan Capital, because I think a key piece of what he's going to bring to the conversation is this idea of empathizing with users. So it's empathizing with who the end users are. What are the outcomes that they want, and what experience do they expect in alignment with that? And in order to achieve that, of course, can a solidly procurement person with a procurement background design and roll out a solution that provides the type of user experience that is needed for people outside of procurement? And that's sort of a philosophical question that's at the basis of some of what we'll be talking about for the rest of today and tomorrow. But all of these things, we can rank them, but they're all incredibly closely aligned, at least if we're going to be successful.
Yeah, and one of the things that I'm looking forward to talking to Jack about tomorrow is this idea, not necessarily an idea, it's what he sees, and without taking too much of the thunder away from the session, is just because there are some early adopters doesn't mean that that procurement as a profession is changing and is evolving. And that's honestly kind of that pre-conversation is for our session tomorrow, is where the idea came to, our minds around crossing the chasm, because we really are kind of stuck in that chasm of, you have a lot of folks who are thinking about, you've got these new business models, new tech-driven models for procurement, new ways of thinking about what the role of procurement should be, what should we be giving up, that are all happening on one side of the chasm, but it's not necessarily making the leap yet at scale.
Yeah. And that is one of the key things I know we'll hear about tomorrow, but also comes from the book, is this idea that if you do the right thing and get a lot of feedback from the innovators and the very early adopters, you may in some ways be designing a solution that the early and late majority are never going to embrace. And so back to that idea of community, both on the practitioner side and the provider side, making sure you're not just tailoring and rolling out a solution that very well meets the expectations of this relatively small group of advanced people, but is going to appeal and deliver the kinds of results that a much larger community of people are looking for.
Yeah. Now, going off script a little bit, because I know that you've done a lot of work in supply market intelligence and sources of information and validating sources of information. Because what I'm thinking is, to get the confidence to be able to kind of jump that chasm, you need to make the business case internally.
Yes.
What are some of the data or information sources that that somebody can look at, where they can build a picture, where they can go internally and say, my business case is based on this, and this, external insights, external experiences, journeys that others have been on, to kind of give it some gravitas, if you will, to being so that it can be taken seriously internally.
Yeah. And I do think that actually has a lot to do with where the specific solution or type of solution is on its maturity curve.
Mm-hmm.
So let's see if I can do this backwards. If you're right at the very beginning of your journey, you're actually going to find that traditional sources of information are either completely not available or are very splotchy.
Mm-hmm.
As you move across that adoption curve, you're going to find all kinds of information. There's very little risk. But at that point, the opportunity to differentiate and create an advantage diminishes. So it's sort of like a trade-off. The more certain the information that you gather through traditional market intelligence sources, the less opportunity there is that you're going to do something truly disruptive in your company. The earlier you are, the less certainty there is, the less external information there is, but also there's a proportionately larger opportunity for you to really set your company apart and position them as leaders. And so going back to Jaime's idea about making sure that culture is the strongest leg in that stool, understand not only procurement's appetite for risk, but the whole company. Are they excited at the prospect of taking some thoughtfully contained risk and maybe having it not go well, but having a chance to grab at that brass ring of doing something truly unique? Or are they more comfortable waiting? Because it's understanding that set of circumstances you're functioning in that's going to help you pull in feedback from peers, traditional market research, and then ultimately make the decision about where to put those digital dollars.
Yeah, and the carefully contained risk part is important, I think.
Yeah.
Because you can't change the culture you're always going to be fighting against the culture of your
Yes.
organization if the culture of your organization is extremely conservative. But that doesn't preclude you from trying to do anything. And I think actually the US Department of State is a great example, because you anticipate an organization that's that large, that is that visible and present, doesn't want to be taking risks, but that can't stop progress. So it's how do you kind of drive progress in that stage? And I mean, I think to my career, I've been in companies where the culture wasn't a change-oriented one earlier in my career, and I think, okay, there's no chance, so why do I even try? But the reality is there is always pockets where you can drive change, and then those build up. You can ultimately compound the impact of those, and it starts to snowball if they go well. So it's searching for what those are.
Pocket is a great way to look at it, right? We talk about sort of this carefully contained risk. You can do it quick. You can do it small. Nobody ever has to know if it didn't go well. So even if it seems like a very risky solution to try with, as long as you can contain the impact that it has, it's probably still worth going ahead and giving it a try and seeing what is learned from the process.
Well, I think it's time for us to start wrapping up, Kelly. So thanks for joining me on this chat around Crossing the Chasm, and how I think that this is fundamental to the future of procurement in how we approach this. And again, it's not right versus wrong or anything like that. It's this is something that collectively, as we went all the way back to that first question about people seeking peer recommendations and feedback, it goes back to how do we as a community help each other drive forward, so that we're able to kind of cross that chasm collectively.
Absolutely. And there is, in fact, safety in numbers. And the next time, whether you're a provider or practitioner, you're working your way through that chasm, make sure you stop in and say hi.
Well, let's wrap this session up. The next session is actually going to be talking about how do we run successful pilots with procurement tech startups. So it's really a great follow-on as we're talking about where are those pockets or where are those opportunities. How can you look at situations where you're containing your risk, and that's going to be with Johnson & Johnson. So we are really looking forward to that session, and Helen, I believe, will be moderating and facilitating that. So we shall see you all over there, I think, in about 5 minutes' time. Thanks, everybody.